All right, welcome to the second part of my lecture on Thomas Kuhn and scientific revolutions. In this lecture, we're going to assess Kuhn and his arguments in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And as I mentioned in the earlier lecture, we're going to be revisiting some of these arguments in the next few weeks because, as I mentioned, he was incredibly influential in a lot of different strands of thought and a lot of movements, which is why I taught him first. But some of this stuff will make more sense in the next lectures. So, here's a question. Is Thomas Kuhn right that there is no purely theoretically neutral claims or data? Could you think of a claim that people of different paradigms might agree on? For example, geocentrists and heliocentrists had data that they probably did agree on. So I think Galileo and Aristotle could agree that the sun set at 7 p.m. last night, that there was a full moon last week, that when rocks had dropped from towers, they hit the ground. So it seems like there is theoretically neutral statements that people who have believe different paradigms could accept. In fact, this was evident. I've read, if you read the debates between proponents of geocentrism and heliocentrism in the 1500s and 1600s, for example, Galileo's famous book, The Dialogues, it's clear that they did understand each other. And they knew where they agreed, and they knew where they disagreed. So I'm not convinced that by Kuhn's claim that there is no theoretically neutral statements. There are counterexamples to that, and I think there's historical evidence. If you ever want to go into this more in depth, take early modern philosophy with me, and we will spend some time in Galileo. What about Thomas Kuhn's rejection of objective truth? Okay, so recall that according to Kuhn, there is no objective truth. Truth is relative to a paradigm. Well, again, I want you to think about the implications of this. If Thomas Kuhn is right, then it's not the case that some methods or techniques are better than others. But it just seems like some methods are better than others. For example, in medicine, placebo methods and double-blind trials are better methods for testing drugs than earlier methods that didn't take into account the placebo effect. And didn't utilize double-blind trials. And we understand why these are better methods because we understand human biases. I mean, would you want to take drugs that haven't been tested through double-blind trials using placebo methods? Would you be willing to risk that? I don't think you would. What about Thomas Kuhn's claim that truth is paradigm relative? Could you think of any problems with that? Well, according to many philosophers of science, the claim that truth is paradigm relative is self-defeating. What do I mean by that? Well, the claim that truth is paradigm relative, it's either objectively true or it's not objectively true. And when I say objectively true, I mean it's not just true relative to our paradigm. Okay? Well, if it's objectively true, then Kuhn is committed to objective truth after all. So if the claim that truth is relative to a paradigm is objectively true, it's not just true relative to Kuhn's paradigm, then Kuhn's committed to objective truth, in which case the statement that truth is paradigm relative is false. On the other hand, if the claim that truth is paradigm relative is not objectively true, it's only true relative to Kuhn's paradigm, for example, then Thomas Kuhn has no grounds to argue that someone who disagrees with him is wrong. Because maybe in their paradigm it's not relative to a paradigm. So it's a self-defeating claim. The claim that truth is relative to a paradigm. Because it seems to be making a claim about all paradigms and all statements, not just Kuhn's paradigm. So it seems to assume the very thing it wants to... It is committed to assuming what is true, the very thing that it wants to argue is false, basically. This is akin to sawing off the very branch that you're sitting on. It undermines its own support. You've seen this GIF before, and I always put it back because it's funny. Okay. So, here's what I think is a non sequitur. This is what philosophers of science have argued is a non sequitur with Kuhn's thought. So data is theory related. Yes, we get it. We looked at evidence for that in the lecture on theory and observation. Theoretical beliefs do impact what you observe. It is true that much scientific language is theory-laden. Just the very term mass means different things in different theories. Yes. It is also true that science has not always progressed in a linear fashion, where later theories have more true statements than earlier theories, but they hold on to the good parts and get rid of the bad parts, and just kind of moves in this progress towards more and more truth. Okay, it's true that not all scientific change has occurred that way. So Thomas Kuhn has this argument then: data is theory-laden, premise one. Premise two: science has not always progressed in a linear fashion. Kuhn might argue that it has never progressed in a linear fashion. Conclusion: so there is no objective truth. Is this a good argument? I'm going to submit that it is a non sequitur. That is, even if premises 1 and 2 are true, it does not follow that 3 is true. So basically 1 and 2 can be true, but 3 is false. In fact, we just saw reasons for why premise 3 is false in an earlier slide. Remember? It's self-defeating. Okay? So 3 probably is false, even though 1 and 2 are true. So it seems like this argument is a non sequitur. And it is a non sequitur. 1 and 2 can be true even though 3 is false. So this points then to 2 different interpretations of Kuhn that were prominent. So philosophers of science were quick to recognize the strengths of Thomas Kuhn's arguments in his book. Like, we do need to pay attention to the history of science. We need to pay attention to the social structure of science. We need to pay attention to the non-rational factors that have influenced scientific change. Yes, we agree with you, Thomas Kuhn, on that. But we don't agree with you, Thomas, that it follows that all truth is relative to a paradigm, that you're trapped in your paradigm, that you can't compare paradigms and all that stuff. We're not going to go with you that far. So a lot of philosophers took that track. But there's different groups of people who took a very strong interpretation of Kuhn, what we call the hard interpretation. And they agreed with his more, I guess you could say, radical conclusions. A lot of sociologists of science in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which we'll look at soon, for example, agreed with him on that. So again, some of his readers took Thomas Kuhn to take the very strong stance that science itself is just not rational. Science is no better than astrology, or perhaps religion, or just your preferences for different types of fashions. But it's nothing more than that. It's just, subjective. And if that's the case, then think about this. If science is not rational, then it's not, it's no more rational to believe it's better to sterilize surgical instruments than it is to believe that it doesn't matter if you sterilize surgical instruments. Okay, that's an implication. If science is not rational, if it hasn't progressed in some sort of linear fashion, if you can't compare theories on their merits and say this theory is better than that, then this is what you're committed to. Okay, so when they introduced antiseptic techniques to surgery in the 1800s, for example, Joseph Lister, based on Semmelweis's discoveries, it's no more rational to say you should wash your hands and surgical instruments before operating on someone than it is to say, you don't need to wash your hands or your surgical instruments. Go ahead and cut that person open. Okay? Now, if you think that's ridiculous, and if you think, oh no, it is definitely true that you should wash your surgical instruments and your hands before operating on someone, because of the germ theory of disease, then you disagree with a hard interpretation of Kuhn, basically. Okay? You think science is in some sense rational. Okay? And I think most people in 2021, well, actually, I take that back. Most of you in my class, I would say, in 2021, agree that this hard interpretation has got some problems. Okay. Kuhn, aware of the criticisms, moderated his view. Well, actually, he claims he always had this view and he was misunderstood. So it's up for debate whether he actually always had this kinder, softer view that I'm about to present, or if he just moderated his view in response to the criticisms. But nonetheless, later on, he said, this is what I actually think. I think that science is rational, okay? I'm not denying that science is rational. Instead, what Thomas Kuhn claimed is that we need to just rethink what it means to be rational, okay? So there's a certain conception of rationality that I have shown is not an accurate depiction of scientific change. We need to reject a certain conception of rationality. But that doesn't mean that science is not rational. It just means that it's not rational in the way we thought it was. This kinder, softer, more moderate view is actually pretty plausible, so let's take a look at it. So here's the old view. Scientists would use algorithms to assess competing theories, like Copernicanism versus geocentrism, or the germ theory of disease versus the humoral theory of disease. Well, an algorithm, it's a set of rules that allows us to compute an answer to a particular question, right? So when it comes to theory choice in science, the set of rules will tell you which theory to choose. Let's just take a look at a very simple example. Here's two theories, theory 1 and theory 2. Both theories are simple. Both theories explain a particular phenomena. 3 different phenomena, actually. Phenomena 1, 2, and 3. However, theory 1 is also consistent with other theories that are accepted by scientists, whereas theory 2 is inconsistent with these theories. So it seems that theory 1 is better than theory 2, right? All right, so according to a lot of empiricist philosophers that Thomas Kuhn was responding to, theory choice always had this kind of simple algorithmic structure where there's clear rules to decide between theories. It's almost like you make a list of the pros and cons and then choose the one with the more pros. Thomas Kuhn was right that a lot of scientific change and a lot of progress in the history of science wasn't following this simple algorithmic procedure, okay? It's a bit more messy than that, all right? And he's right. Much progress in the history of science is not algorithmic like this, okay? So here's the new view then. Science is rational, okay? But it's not rational in this algorithmic sense, okay? Much scientific change isn't algorithmic, okay? So what we need to reject is not the rationality of science. We only need to reject a certain conception of scientific rationality, the algorithmic view, okay? So what the positive idea is, there's been different ideas tossed about, which I won't go into. One's called pragmatism, but I think you get the point though. There's more than one way to rationally decide between theories, and it isn't this algorithmic view always. So, all right. So this is a class on scientific controversies and misinformation in science. So let's just take again, a lot of this stuff will make more sense in coming weeks, especially next week when we look at some of the lectures. But just as a preview, I want to just show you why we're looking at Kuhn and how he is relevant to what this class is about. First off, on the positive side, he was right that we should study the social structure of science. Science is not a solitary activity, okay? It's done in a community. Not that show from 10 years ago, Community. But he was right, and we're going to be looking at that next week. He's right that we should pay attention to how science is taught in schools, how young scientists are trained, how science is published, what incentivizes various types of scientific research. For example, if research on the health risks of pregnant women smoking is funded by tobacco companies, that might be something that's concerning. Well, also, what areas scientists are in consensus on. So we'll be looking at this as well in a separate lecture, but sometimes, so for example, 97% of climate scientists agree that global warming is caused by human-emitted greenhouse gas emissions. Is that a reason to believe that it is true that global warming is currently happening due to greenhouse gas emissions? I'm going to argue yes as a preview. But what is distinctive about this consensus? Whereas there's been other examples in the history of science where scientists were in consensus and they were wrong. For example, during Semmelweis's time, the guy who discovered that you should wash your hands after you've handled a corpse and before you deliver a baby, most of the scientists were in consensus at that time that diseases were caused by humoral imbalances. So you didn't need to wash your hands. So, why is some types of scientific consensus evidence that the scientists are saying something true, and when is it not? So these are important things to think about. However, Kuhn is probably wrong that most scientists are dogmatically committed to the core tenets of the paradigms. All right, they'll work within it, but if there's enough evidence, they probably will abandon it, and I think that's accurate for a lot of scientists in a lot of fields. Of course, they're probably going to be way more reluctant to abandon core ideas than peripheral ones, but that's because, not because they're dogmatic, it's because there's a wealth of evidence supporting the core ideas. So going back, we've known about the greenhouse effect since the 1800s. We've known that greenhouse gases are heat-trapping gases. There's just a ton of evidence for that. We're not going to abandon that. That's up there with abandoning the idea that, the Earth orbits the sun. It's just so much evidence for that. It would take some crazy stuff to happen to dislodge that. Whereas there are peripheral views about climate change that climate scientists probably will reject or revise. When we have our guest lecturer who's a climate scientist, Dr. Miriam Jones, she could probably explain that. Doesn't mean you give up the idea of the greenhouse gas effect. It just means you rethink, we're understanding all sorts of stuff about how climate change impacts polar vortexes, about how it impacts the jet stream, how it impacts, drought versus monsoons. And we're getting more and more data about this all the time. So, of course, there's going to be some revisions to various predictions made by climate scientists. But that doesn't mean they're going to give up some of the core ideas, many of which are rooted in just basic physics. Okay. This is I might lecture on this as well. I did it last time I taught this class. So in the 2000s, like 2005, 2003 era, there was a group of figures, who were trying to get intelligent design theory taught in schools, and claiming that this is an alternative and a better explanation of biological variation than Darwin's evolutionary theory. These guys mostly had a lot of very advanced degrees, and they, were fluent in a lot of stuff we're talking about in this class, and they would actually take arguments from Thomas Kuhn's book and argue that intelligent design is a new paradigm that's going to replace Darwinism. There's too many anomalies with Darwinism, and so intelligent design is the new exemplar, and these are the rebel scientists that are, the future of biology, and with their better paradigm, they can do more stuff. Okay, so we'll talk about, we'll assess this later, but just to say that Kuhn has been used by sophisticated scientific, I guess you could say, contrarians. Likewise, and so the intelligent design, as I mentioned, was kind of a school of thought that you could say came from the political right. Religious conservatives liked it. So Kuhn also influenced, I guess you could say, the political left. So the 1960s through the 1980s, there was this program called the Strong Program in Sociology of Science. It came mostly from Europe. And they argued that science is merely a product of society, and that scientists' beliefs are explained by social factors rather than by scientific evidence for the beliefs. So scientists don't believe that global warming is happening because of the evidence for global warming. They believe it's happening just because of peer pressure. Scientists don't believe that you should, sterilize your surgical instruments before operating on someone because of the evidence of harm based on the germ theory of disease. Instead, it's just because of, again, peer pressure or other social factors. Okay. So, likewise, just keep in mind, like skeptics, all current scientific programs have anomalies and shortcomings. Okay, they all do. And that's, if they had nothing, if there were no anomalies and shortcomings, there'd be nothing for them to do. Like that, but what they're working on day to day in the lab is these puzzles, these shortcomings, these anomalies. That's why there are still departments of chemistry and physics and biology and climate science and so on. So what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So skeptics and deniers, they'll mine mainstream journals looking for anomalies and shortcomings. But that's not evidence that the research program is just fatally flawed and should be dispensed with. Okay, I could explain this article in class if you want. Someone sent it to me in this Daily Mail article. Basically, one model run in climate, done by one group of scientists, showed that the Earth is going to warm at a slightly slower pace than other models predicted. So instead of warming 2 degrees Celsius by 2100, it might warm 1.7 degrees Celsius by 2100. So some climate deniers took this as evidence that the whole field of climate scientists is just completely failed because one particular model run had a slightly different prediction than other models. Never mind the fact that all the models agree that the Earth is warming. It's just one predicted it's going to warm slightly slower. So that's again, skeptics and deniers will kind of mine journals looking for these things and then try to argue that the whole field is flawed. Which, of course, that does not at all evidence that the whole field is flawed. So again, I don't think you shouldn't abandon theories like this unless there's a really promising, viable alternative. And the issue is, skeptics and deniers, they don't offer a viable alternative. They haven't offered a better way to understand the stuff that the current paradigms are explaining. Okay. And it might be the case that these anomalies that have arisen right now we'll find an explanation for them later. Okay, it's not evidence that the theory is bankrupt. It's just need for more research. So again, unless they've offered a really awesome, viable alternative, so like the germ theory of disease was a very viable alternative to the humoral imbalance theory of disease. Copernicanism was a very viable alternative that explained a whole lot of stuff compared to geocentrism. Einstein's theory of relativity explained a lot of stuff that Newton's theory couldn't. Okay. Darwinian evolution by natural selection was able to explain a lot of variation that other theories at the time weren't quite able to explain. So again, you have to have a viable alternative. If not, then it's not a reason to abandon the paradigm. Okay, again, sometimes a theory is so well supported by the available evidence that it's far more reasonable to believe the theory even if there are some anomalies. So the anomalies, yes, there are anomalies, but that doesn't shake the incredible amount of evidence for the theory. Okay, the anomalies aren't evidence that the theory is bankrupt. All right, that's it. The end.